Now we have been through the lipophilic hormones and the protein hormones, and now we will move to the third class of hormones, which are the monoamines. Monoamines are hormones derived from one amino acid, from single amino acids. That's why they are called mono, for one, or single amines, because they have an amine function and they are derived from single amino acid. So they are amino acid derived hormones, um, and they are derived from tyrosine and tryptophan. They can be either derived from tyrosine, either from tryptophan. In fact, we have two classes of monoamines, the catecholamines, and the second class is the melatonin and serotonin. The catecholamines are derived from the tyrosine as an amino acid. They have tyrosine as a precursor, and the melatonin and serotonin, they have the tryptophan as the amino acid precursor. So they are derived either from the tyrosine, either from the tryptophan. The catecholamines are derived from the tyrosine, melatonin and serotonin are derived from the tryptophan. Now, in the catecholamine class or subclass, we have the dopamines, noradrenaline, and the adrenaline. Noradrenaline is also called the epinephrine, the norepinephrine, and the adrenaline is called the epinephrine also. And we have the second class is the melatonin and serotonin. Now, the serotonin, I didn't write it here because it doesn't have a role in the reproductive functions. Both of those classes of monoamines, the catecholamines and the melatonin, they are they have reproductive neuroendocrine control mechanism. So they have effects on the reproductive function. Now the tyrosine is converted into dopamine, will have few small modifications and will become a dopamine. And the synthesis of dopamine occurs in the hypothalamus, and the dopamine is an important modulator of the prolactin secretion. In fact, it inhibits the secretion of prolactin. And the dopamine will be converted into noradrenaline, and the noradrenaline will be converted into adrenaline. So all of them, those three hormones, are derived from the tyrosine, and each one will be converted to the other hormone. The dopamine is also known as the happiness hormone with the serotonin. They give us the feeling of happiness. Um, and the adrenaline is known to be secretion to be increased during the feeling of fear or anger, and it induces the heart beating, an increase in the heart rate and the heart beating rates, muscles contraction, um, and so it is induced during stress or fear or anger. But regarding the reproductive function, the dopamine is a modulator of the prolactin secretion, and they have also the catecholamines. They have an effect on the uterine muscles. Now, the melatonin and the serotonin, they are derived from the tryptophan. So the tryptophan, this is an amino acid that will be converted into serotonin, and then the serotonin will be converted into melatonin. The synthesis of the melatonin occurs in the pineal gland. Pineal gland is a very small gland in the back of the brain. This is the pineal gland here, and here occurs the synthesis of the melatonin. The synthesis of the melatonin is described as the sleep hormone in general. It is the hormone that makes us feel asleep, and its production is related to the day and night cycles. and its production is increased during the night. That's why we feel asleep. We feel that we need to sleep during the night and not during the day. And the persons who have a problem in the secretion of melatonin cannot sleep well. That's why they can buy pills of melatonin from the pharmacy. It will help them to sleep. So the synthesis of melatonin occurs in the pineal gland under environmental conditions. Uh, of those environmental conditions are the cycles of the day and night, and it was described to regulate reproductive activity in seasonally breeding animals. So it have an important role in reproduction in the seasonally breeding animals, but not in humans. It is involved in complex behaviors such as sleep, pain control, and sexual behavior and hormone secretion. And also, it was described to inhibit. Um, it was described to have an inhibiting role of the gametogenesis in the females, but it is not well known at which extent and how it exerts effect. So it's not well studied yet, but and now there are contraceptive pills that associate the melatonin to progesterone for contraception in women. Here we can see the catecholamine family, which are derived from the tyrosine. We have the tyrosine as a precursor amino acid, and this tyrosine will be converted into dopamine. So we'll have slight modifications on the structure of the tyrosine. You can see here and here, and so it will be this molecule, this new molecule will be the dopamine, and then the dopamine will be converted into norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and then the noradrenaline will be converted into epinephrine or adrenaline. We can see here what are the modifications that happen at the level of the structure. Here we can see the synthesis of melatonin and serotonin from the tryptophan. We have this is the amino acid the tryptophan precursor, and it will undergo several modifications to give serotonin first, and then the serotonin will be modified to give the melatonin. And that's why we say that they are monoamines, or they are uh, uh, they are hormones derived from a single amino acid derived hormone. Now that we have talked about the mode of secretion and the classification of the hormones, we will move to talk about the mode of action of those hormones. Now, regarding the hormone activity, we have said that the hormones can bind either receptors on the surface of the cell or receptors inside of the cell, intracellular receptors. So, since they can bind to another protein, which is a receptor, they are considered as ligands. So, the hormones are ligands that they can bind to specific receptors for them. Okay, so those receptors can be either on the surface or intracellular according to the nature of the hormone. Whenever we have a lipid soluble hormone, so a lipophilic hormone, which is the case of the steroids, for example, their receptors will be intracellular. They can be either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus, depending on the type of the hormone. And whenever we have a water soluble or a hydrophilic hormone, like in the case of the protein hormones, they will have membrane bound receptors through which they will exert their action. And now we will see how. So the localization of the receptor depends on the nature of the hormone. Whenever we have lipophilic hormone, the receptor will be intracellular, can be cytoplasmic or nuclear. And whenever we have a water-soluble hormone, its receptor will be on the cytoplasmic membrane. So it will be a membrane-bound receptor. Now let's take the case of the lipid-soluble hormones. We have said that in this class of hormone, we have talked about the steroid hormones. The thyroid hormones are not don't have a role in the reproductive process, but they are also lipophilic hormones. Um, we have talked about the eicosanoids, but the eicosanoids, we have said that they are a little bit specific and they don't, they need a membrane receptor. They are not like the steroid hormones. So here, the lipid-soluble hormones, we will be talking in the way of action of the steroid hormones and the thyroid hormones, since they are both lipophilic and they have the same way of action. So as we have said, lipophilic hormones diffuse in the blood circulation, and they will migrate or circulate in the blood, and then once they reach their target organ, they pass from the blood circulation to the interstitial space, which is the space between the blood vessels or capillaries and the cells. And then from the interstitial space, they can go to the cell. Now, due to their lipophilic nature, they don't have uh, receptors on the cell membrane. Due to their lipophilic nature, they can diffuse through the cytoplasmic membrane, which is also lipophilic, which is rich in lipids. So they can diffuse through the cytoplasmic membrane without the need of transporters or of receptors on the on the surface of this membrane. So they diffuse inside of the cell, and inside of the cell they have intracellular receptors. The receptors can be either cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors. So the molecule will go in the cell, and if it finds its receptor in the cytoplasm, it will bind to its receptors in the cytoplasm, and if its receptor is nuclear, it will bind to, it can go to diffuse in the nucleus, and then it will bind its receptor. So those lipid-soluble hormones have intracellular receptors, and those receptors can be cytosolic or nuclear. Now, what happens when they bind to their receptors? The structure of those receptors is complementary to the hormone. So whenever a hormone find receptor having having a domain, so those receptors have ligand binding domain and have a DNA binding domain from another side. So the ligand binding domain of the receptor will be specific to the hormone and can fix the hormone, or the hormone can bind to its specific receptor at this ligand binding domain. Once this hormone is bound to its receptor, we will have hormone receptor complex, which will lead, and this hormone receptor complex will migrate to the nucleus. And in fact, this binding of the hormone to its receptor uh, will expose the DNA binding region of the receptor to the outside. So this region of the receptor that can bind to the DNA will be exposed to the outside and can bind to specific regions on the DNA. And in this way, it can regulate the expression of certain genes. Now, this uh, hormone receptor complex, um, so the hormone receptor complex, as we said, can bind to the DNA. And in fact, it will bind to specific regions on the promoter on some genes. So the genes have a coding sequence, as you know, and a promoter region or a promoter sequence. And some genes have in their promoter region, they have a hormone response element. They have a small sequence called a hormone response element. This small sequence can bind to those hormone receptors complex. So those hormone response element can be recognized and bound by the receptor, by the hormone receptor complex, and thus whenever we have this hormone receptor complex, it will migrate to the nucleus and it will bind to this hormone response element on the promoter region of some genes. And following this binding, we will have either an activation of the transcription of this gene, or this binding will inhibit the transcription of the gene. So when we have, let's say, an activation of the transcription of the gene, this gene can be transcribed into messenger RNA, and then the messenger RNA be translated to give a protein. That's how we modify or we create a response in the cell. That's how those steroid hormones or lipophilic hormones can create a response in the cell. So by binding to their receptors, and then those receptors have DNA binding regions, which can bind hormone response element on the genes, on the promoter sequence of a gene, and as a consequence, they will induce a modification in the gene expression. Either they activate the gene expression or they can inhibit some gene expressions. So that's how the lipid soluble hormones can, as the steroid hormones, for example, can create a response in the cell. Now, the water soluble hormones, they are hydrophilic hormones. Since they are hydrophilic, and because the cytoplasmic membrane is lipophilic, they cannot diffuse through the cytoplasmic membrane. That's why they have receptors bound or there is membrane bound receptors or receptors on the surface of the cytoplasmic membrane. So those hormones, those hydrophilic hormones, will bind to their receptors on the surface of the cell. So those receptors, here we have a hormone bound to its membrane bound receptor. Those membrane bound receptors, they have an extracellular region, and they have an intracellular region. Whenever those hormones are bound to their receptors on the extracellular region, this will induce a conformational change of the receptor. And here, for example, we have the example of G-coupled protein receptor. Those types of receptors are coupled to G proteins. Whenever the hormone will bind to its receptor, this will induce modification in the G protein, and which will induce an activation of other enzymes. We will talk about them, and then they will induce a signaling cascade that will lead to a cellular response. So the binding of the hormone to its receptor, its membrane bound receptor, will lead to a signaling cascade, which will lead to an activation of many enzymes, and this will lead to a cellular response. And so that's how the hydrophilic or the water soluble hormone can induce a response inside of the cell. Now, those hydrophilic hormones, we said they are the monoamines, the peptides or the protein hormones. And the eicosanoids, they are lipophilic, but they are specific. They cannot fuse through the cytoplasmic membrane, and they need the presence of the of membrane-bound receptors to exert their action on the cell. They need those hormones need a membrane-bound receptor and not intracellular receptor. They don't have intracellular receptors, but they have membrane-bound receptors. So they are receptors located on the plasma membrane, and following the binding of the hormone to its receptor, this will induce a cascade of signaling that will lead to an activation of many enzymes, and also it might induce the activation of transcription factors that are located in the cytoplasm, and then they can move to the nucleus and they can induce the transcription of many genes. So here we are talking, took an example of receptor, which is the G-coupled protein receptor. We have other type of receptors that can be activated by those hormones, which are the tyrosine kinase receptors. But here we will talk only about this kind of receptors, the G-coupled protein receptors, how they induce a response inside of the cell. So, and the hormone will bind to its receptor called a G-coupled protein receptor. So the hormone now is considered as the first messenger. Okay, it is the first messenger that will induce a response inside of the cell. The hormone will bind to its receptor. This receptor is coupled to G protein. Now we will not go into details of how this G protein will be activated, but following the hormone receptor binding, there will be an activation of the G protein and this activation will lead to an activation of an enzyme, which is the adenylate cyclase, or this enzyme is also called the adenylyl cyclase or adenylate cyclase. So this adenylate cyclase is an enzyme that will transform the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate, into a cyclic adenosine monophosphate, cyclic AMP. It is called cyclic AMP. So the adenylate cyclase will convert the ATP into a cyclic AMP. And then this cyclic AMP is the second messenger. It is considered as a second messenger because it will induce a cascade of signaling downstream of it. So the first messenger was the hormone, the second messenger is the cyclic AMP. Once the cyclic AMP is formed, it will induce the activation of protein kinases in the cell. Protein kinases are enzymes that catalyze the phosphorylation of proteins. And in fact, many proteins in the cell or many enzymes in the cells are activated following their phosphorylation. So the phosphorylation of some enzymes leads to their activation. Okay, so this cyclic AMP activate those protein kinases. It will lead to their activation. So those kinases will become active. They can then, since they are active, they can activate the enzymes or the proteins by phosphorylating them. So those activated protein kinases will transform a non-phosphorylated protein into a phosphorylated and active protein, P4-phospho. So protein P is a phosphorylated protein. And this phosphorylation, so the reaction phosphorylation is made possible due to the transformation of an ATP molecule to ADP. So the phosphate group is taken from an ATP molecule. So those protein kinases catalyzes the transformation or catalyzes the phosphorylation of proteins or of enzymes by using the ATP and transforming it into ADP, adenosine diphosphate. In this way, we will have phosphorylated and activated proteins or enzymes that can induce many reactions in the cell, and also we can have activation of many this will lead to many physiological responses following the activation of those enzymes, and sometimes you can have the activation of transcription factors also, which can lead to which can go in the nucleus and activate the transcription of some genes also. So this is how the cascade of signaling happens. So this is how after the hormone, what happens. So this is how um, we have a cascade signaling following the hormone binding to its receptor. And now, once this response starts, after a certain moment, we will have the activation of an enzyme called the phosphodiesterase. This phosphodiesterase will inhibit the cyclic AMP, will come and will inactivate the cyclic AMP, and then as a consequence of its inactivation by the phosphodiesterase, the signaling cascade downstream of it will be arrested, and so the response of the cell to the hormone will be stopped. So after a while, we will have the phosphodiesterase that will inactivate the cyclic AMP, and that's how we will stop the response of the cell to the hormone. Here also we can see how the hormone can bind to its receptor on the surface membrane. Um, and then following this binding, here we have the case of a G-coupled protein receptor. This G-coupled protein receptors will be activated. So the GDP, this is a protein coupled to guanosine diphosphate that will be transformed into GTP and active, and it will activate the adenylate cyclase. This adenylate cyclase will transform the ATP into cyclic AMP, and this cyclic AMP is a second messenger responsible for the physiological, the cellular responses. The cyclic AMP will activate the protein kinases in the cell, which will lead to the phosphorylation of many proteins, and it will lead to a cellular response. Now here we can review a little bit the mechanism of action of hormones. So following a stimulus, a cell can produce hormones, where we will have some cells that will produce steroid hormones, other cells will produce, let's say, proteins hormones or polypeptide hormones. So according to the type of the hormones produced, the mechanism of action in the target cell will be different. The polypeptide hormones will bind to a membrane-bound receptor and will induce a signaling cascade or signal transduction pathway through binding to a membrane-bound receptor. However, the steroid hormones, uh, they can diffuse through the cell membrane of their target cell. So in the target cell, they will diffuse through the cell membrane and will bind to specific receptors, intracellular specific receptors, and those specific receptors will move to the nucleus and will bind specific regions on the DNA in the nucleus, and that's how they will affect the transcription of many genes, and so that's how they will affect the response of the cell. Now here we have a comparison of the hormones according to their solubility. So we have the lipophilic hormones like the steroids and the thyroid hormones, and we have the hydrophilic hormones like the polypeptides and the proteins hormones, the amino-derived hormones or the monoamines, the glycoproteins, and the catecholamines, which are also amino-derived hormones. All of those are hydrophilic hormones. So lipophilic hormones, uh, uh, they need transport protein or carrier proteins when they are transported in the blood. However, the hydrophilic hormones, they don't need carrier proteins because they are hydrophilic, and the plasma is hydrophilic also. The lipophilic proteins, they have long half-lives that can last from hours to days. However, the hydrophilic hormones have short half-lives. In general, it's about minutes. We're talking about minutes. The lipophilic hormones have intracellular receptors, as we have seen, and the hydrophilic hormones have plasma membrane bound receptors. And the lipophilic hormones, the case of the lipophilic hormones, the mediator or the messenger, the second messenger, are the receptor hormone complex themselves. So the mediator or the messenger is the receptor hormone complex itself, which migrate to the nucleus and bind to a specific region, to hormone binding regions on the promoter, and will induce a cell response. However, in the case of the hydrophilic hormones, uh, the binding of the hormone to its membrane receptor will induce the production of second messenger as the cyclic AMP that we have seen. We can have other second messenger we didn't talk about, like the cyclic GMP, the calcium, and a kinase cascades. So the mediators, the response in the cell is, in the case of hydrophilic hormone, is mediated through second messengers as a cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP, and calcium, and the cascade of kinases, which is not the case of the lipophilic hormones like the steroids, which the mediator will be the receptor hormone complex itself. Well, this was all regarding this session, and if you have any questions, we will talk about them, or you can ask them in the next session. Thank you for your attention.